Man raised a lynx and a bobcat, but when they grew up, everyone was shocked. The spring thaw struck like a catastrophe, turning the creek by Abe Whitaker's mountain cabin into a violent torrent. In nearly 10 years among these Colorado peaks, the 64-year-old former pastor had never seen the land bare its teeth like this. The stream that usually murmured past his logs now roared, swollen with snowmelt, choked with torn branches and sliding stone. Pines groaned, boulders rolled. The valley itself seemed to change its mind, cutting new channels and taking whatever couldn't flee, spellbound on the porch. Abe heard a cry slice through the water's thunder so raw, it tightened his grip on the railing. Not a hawk, not a coyote. Something nearer. He grabbed his flashlight, shrugged into the raincoat that had weathered a dozen storms, and stepped into the misting cold, his breath ghosting as night gathered. Following the swollen creek downstream, Abe carefully navigated the treacherous bank where familiar rocks and fallen logs had been transformed into slippery obstacles by the churning water. His flashlight beam danced across the turbulent surface, illuminating branches and debris that raced past like refugees, fleeing some unseen disaster. The beam caught occasional glimpses of wildlife. A raccoon clinging desperately to a half-submerged tree. A family of deer picking their way carefully through the higher ground, all struggling to survive nature's sudden violence. As Abe edged along the slick bank, his boot slid into a hidden hollow, his ankle wrenched, pain lancing up his calf, but he bit back his curse. The kitten needed calm, not startled movements. When he extended his hand, the small lynx pressed closer to its mother and released a low growl that seemed impossibly large for such a fragile frame. A snow lynx kitten, its pristine white fur glowing like captured moonlight against the dark water, clung with tiny claws to the lifeless form of its mother. The adult lynx was magnificent even in death, her thick coat rippling in the current, her powerful limbs now motionless, her golden eyes closed forever against the world that had claimed her life. But it was the kitten that held Abe's attention completely, those impossibly blue eyes staring at him with an expression that transcended every barrier between species. There was no wild panic in that gaze, no feral fear that might be expected from a cornered animal facing a human predator. Instead, there was grief pure, devastating, and utterly recognizable to anyone who had ever loved and lost. The kitten's small body trembled from cold and exhaustion, but its grip on its mother remained unshakable, as if letting go would mean surrendering the last connection to everything it had ever known. The lynx kitten growled softly as he approached, not a threat exactly, but a warning that it would defend its mother's body with its own life if necessary. Abe recognized that sound, having heard similar expressions of desperate loyalty in the voices of parishioners who had refused to leave the bedsides of dying loved ones. Some bonds, he knew, could not be severed by death alone. And attempting to separate this kitten from its mother would be an act of cruelty that would destroy whatever trust might be possible between them. "I understand, little one," Abe whispered, his voice barely audible above the roar of rushing water. "We'll take her with us. I promise." Without hesitation, Abe removed his thick wool coat and carefully wrapped both mother and kitten together, speaking in the same low, soothing tones he had once used to comfort grieving families during his years in the ministry. The kitten's growls softened to barely audible whimpers, as it sensed the genuine compassion in this strange giant, who smelled of wood smoke and kindness, cradling the precious bundle against his chest. Abe began the treacherous journey back upstream toward his cabin. Each step was a careful negotiation with the slippery rocks and his injured ankle, but the weight of responsibility drove him forward through the pain. The kitten's small body generated almost no warmth through the coat, and Abe found himself silently praying to a god he hadn't addressed directly in years, that he wouldn't be too late to save this beautiful creature. The beam of his flashlight swept across the swollen creek banks as he walked, illuminating the widespread destruction left in the flood's wake. And it was during this careful survey that he spotted another tragedy, unfolding in the darkness, huddled beneath the drooping branches of a willow bush that was half submerged in the rushing water. A small bobcat kitten crouched on the only dry branch it could find. The sight of this second orphan struck Abe like a physical blow. The kitten's rust-colored coat was plastered to its tiny frame by the constant spray from the creek, and it shivered so violently that he could see the motion from 20 feet away. Unlike the lynx kitten, this one made no sound at all. It simply stared with enormous amber eyes that seemed far too large for its delicate face, as if all its energy was focused on the simple act of continuing to exist. "Well, I'll be damned," Abe muttered, immediately feeling guilty for the profanity that had slipped out despite his years away from the pulpit. "Looks like you're coming home with us, too." Little fellow. Approaching the second kitten required even greater care, as the branch it occupied was barely above the waterline and showed signs of weakening under the constant assault of the current. Abe extended one weathered hand while keeping the lynx bundle secure with the other. Speaking in the same gentle tones that had somehow calmed the first kitten, the bobcat offered no resistance as he lifted it from its precarious perch, instead seeming to melt into his palm like it had been waiting for rescue all along. Its small body was even colder than the lynx kitten's, and Abe could feel its heart beating frantically against his fingers like a tiny drum signaling distress. Now carrying both survivors, Abe made his way back to the cabin as darkness settled completely over the mountain forest. The journey seemed to take hours, though his old pocket watch later revealed it had been less than 30 minutes. Each step was a careful calculation of balance and endurance, complicated by his injured ankle, and the precious cargo that depended entirely on his sure footing. The warm glow of oil lamps welcomed him back to the cabin, like beacons of hope in the wilderness. Inside, away from the chaos of the flood, Abe created a makeshift nursery in his small living room, using his softest wool blankets arranged near the stone fireplace, where the heat would be gentle and constant. The lynx kitten still refused to leave its mother's side, so Abe carefully positioned them together on the blankets while he mentally prepared for the difficult task ahead. Under the spreading branches of an ancient cypress tree that his late wife Sarah had planted decades ago, Abe spent the next several hours digging a grave in the partially frozen ground. Each shovelful of earth was a labor of both body and soul, made more difficult by his twisted ankle and the emotional weight of witnessing such profound loss. The lynx kitten watched every moment of this process, never making a sound, but somehow communicating its understanding that this ritual was necessary for both of them to move forward. When Abe gently lowered the magnificent lynx into the earth, speaking words of gratitude for the life she had lived and the precious gift she had left behind, the kitten remained perfectly still beside the grave. As clumps of soil fell onto the beautiful coat, Abe found himself remembering his own wife's funeral and the way grief could feel like drowning in slow motion. "She was a good mother," he said softly, not sure if he was speaking to the kitten, to Sarah's memory, or to the mountain itself. "She raised you to be strong. Little one, now we have to be strong together." Back inside the cabin's warmth, Abe turned his attention to the immediate needs of his new responsibilities. He named the lynx kitten Luna for her moonlight-colored fur and the ethereal quality that seemed to surround her, like an aura. The bobcat, despite his silence, displayed a fierce stubbornness in his refusal to show weakness, despite his obviously traumatic ordeal. Rusty seemed like the perfect name for a creature whose rust-colored coat and iron reminded Abe of the old farm tools that had served his family for generations. The first week tested every ounce of patience, skill, and determination that Abe possessed. Both kittens ran dangerously high fevers that left them listless and unresponsive to his attempts at feeding. He tried everything he could think of: warm goat's milk, softened cat food from his emergency supplies, even tiny pieces of cooked chicken hand-fed with infinite patience. but they turned away from every offering with the stubborn resignation of creatures who had lost the will to live. Their small bodies seemed to be consuming themselves from the inside, burning through whatever reserves they had left in a desperate attempt to survive the trauma they had endured. Abe found himself checking their breathing every few minutes throughout the day and night, terrified that each shallow breath might be their last. Sleep became impossible as he maintained constant vigil over the two fragile lives that had somehow become the most important things in his world. He moved his rocking chair next to their makeshift bed and dozed fitfully between feeding attempts, always awakening at the slightest change in their breathing patterns, or the smallest sound that might indicate distress. On the third night, Luna's condition took a dramatic and terrifying turn for the worse. Her body temperature dropped so low that she felt cold to the touch, and her breathing became so shallow that Abe had to hold a small mirror near her nose to confirm she was still alive. Panic gripped him with icy fingers as he realized he was about to lose this beautiful creature that had somehow become infinitely precious to him in such a short time. "Not on my watch," he whispered fiercely, settling into his rocking chair with Luna wrapped in his warmest blanket. "I didn't pull you out of that creek to watch you die in my living room." He began the painstaking process of feeding her warm milk one drop at a time through a medicine pipette, his hands shaking with exhaustion and emotion as he worked through the night. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, while outside the wind howled through the pines like a chorus of lost souls. It was during this critical hour that Rusty displayed the first sign of the remarkable bond that would define all their lives in the years to come. The small Bobcat, who had maintained a careful distance from both Abe and Luna since their arrival, suddenly crept across the room with surprising stealth and purpose, instead of seeking warmth or comfort for himself. Rusty positioned himself directly next to Luna's motionless form and began gently licking her forehead with his tiny pink tongue. His ministrations were careful and deliberate, like a mother caring for her young, and the effect was immediate and nothing short of miraculous. Luna's breathing steadied almost instantly, and within minutes, a faint purr began to rumble from her small chest, the first sign of life she had shown in nearly 24 hours. Her body temperature slowly returned to normal as Rusty continued his patient care, and by dawn, she was strong enough to lap milk from a shallow dish with shaky but determined movements. "Well, I'll be," Abe murmured, watching this display of interspecies compassion with wonder. "Looks like you two figured out something I missed." From that moment forward, Abe understood that their survival was not dependent solely on his care. These two orphaned creatures needed each other in ways that transcended human understanding or scientific explanation. They had found in each other what he couldn't provide: the comfort of shared experience, the understanding that comes from mutual loss, and the instinctive knowledge that survival sometimes requires cooperation rather than competition. The breakthrough came gradually over the following weeks, as both kittens began to eat regularly and regain their strength. Luna proved to require constant reassurance that Abe was nearby, positioning herself where she could maintain visual contact with him throughout the day. If he stepped outside to chop wood or tend to his small garden, she would move to the window and call for him with soft, trilling sounds that could break a heart. Rusty's personality emerged as more independent on the surface, but his mischievous nature began to reveal itself as his confidence returned. He discovered that his dexterous paws could open cabinet doors, providing access to fascinating objects that could be knocked off shelves for the sheer entertainment value. Heating pads became his particular obsession, and Abe often found his arthritis relief stolen by a small bobcat who had claimed it for his afternoon nap. One morning, while Abe was outside sweeping pine needles from his front porch and enjoying the crisp mountain air, Luna suddenly relapsed into the same frightening stillness that had nearly claimed her life during those first critical nights. Rusty, who had never voluntarily left the cabin's interior since his rescue, burst through the screen door like a furry missile and began calling for Abe with an urgency that communicated the crisis more clearly than any human words could have managed. "What is it, boy?" Abe asked. But Rusty was already racing back toward the cabin, stopping every few steps to ensure the human was following. Inside, Abe found Luna collapsed beside the fireplace. Her breathing labored, and her ice-blue eyes unfocused and distant. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms and began the same careful nursing routine that had saved her before, while Rusty paced frantically around the room, occasionally stopping to nuzzle Luna's dangling paw or lick her face with obvious concern. This time, her recovery was faster, but no less miraculous, and Abe made a solemn vow that he would never again leave them alone during their vulnerable healing period. The incident had demonstrated not only Luna's continued fragility, but also Rusty's remarkable ability to recognize crisis and seek help behavior that suggested intelligence far beyond what Abe had expected from either creature. As spring gradually gave way to summer, both kittens grew into their distinctive personalities with remarkable clarity. Luna developed into a creature of ethereal beauty that seemed to belong more to legend than reality. Her thick white coat became lustrous and soft as silk. Her black-tipped ears remained constantly alert to every sound in her environment, and her ice-blue eyes seemed to possess an almost supernatural depth that suggested she could read thoughts and emotions with uncanny accuracy. Sleep became impossible for Luna unless Abe was within her direct line of sight. If he retired to his bedroom earlier than usual, she would wander the small cabin calling for him with soft trills that echoed through the rooms like the voice of some lonely spirit. Eventually, she would settle herself directly in front of his bedroom door and remain there until sunrise, as if standing guard over his dreams and ensuring that he wouldn't disappear during the night. Rusty's development took a completely different direction, revealing a personality that served as the perfect counterbalance to Luna's ethereal nature. Quick, clever, and endlessly curious, he approached the world with the confidence of a creature that had survived the impossible and emerged stronger for the experience. His russet coat developed beautiful patterns of darker stripes that created natural camouflage, and his amber eyes sparkled with intelligence and barely contained mischief. But beneath Rusty's playful exterior lay a capacity for empathy that consistently amazed Abe and challenged every assumption he had ever held about wild animals. One particularly difficult evening, after spending the day sorting through Sarah's belongings and fighting waves of loneliness that threatened to drown him, Abe fell asleep in his rocking chair with tears still drying on his weathered cheeks. He woke hours later to find Rusty gently licking a small cut on his hand that he had sustained during his wood-chopping session earlier in the day. The bobcat wasn't seeking food or attention. There was no expectation of reward in his careful ministrations. He was simply offering comfort to a friend in pain, recognizing distress, and responding with the only form of healing he understood during Abe's darkest moments, when grief or loneliness threatened to overwhelm him completely. Both animals seemed to sense his emotional state. With supernatural accuracy, they would position themselves on either side of his feet as he sat in his chair, not moving or demanding attention, simply existing as warm, living reminders that he was not alone in the world. Their quiet presence provided more comfort than any well-meaning words from his former parishioners or concerned neighbors could ever offer. The relationship between Luna and Rusty themselves proved to be equally remarkable and constantly evolving. During daylight hours, they competed fiercely over blankets, toys, and Abe's attention, engaging in wrestling matches that often left the cabin furniture slightly rearranged. And Abe chuckling at their antics, but every evening, without fail and without any apparent signal, Luna would ceremoniously lick Rusty's forehead before curling her larger body around his smaller frame, like a living sculpture of devotion and protection. Food became another fascinating expression of their unusual bond, despite being natural competitors in the wild, where resources were scarce, and survival often meant taking whatever you could get. Luna consistently ensured that Rusty received the choicest portions of their meals. When Abe attempted to test this behavior by deliberately giving Luna a better piece of meat, she would immediately carry it directly to Rusty and drop it at his feet before returning to her own bowl. With apparent satisfaction, it was behavior that defied every natural instinct. every evolutionary imperative that should have governed their interactions, yet it seemed as natural as breathing to these two orphan souls who had found in each other something more valuable than biological programming. They had found family. Their peaceful existence was dramatically disrupted one crisp October morning when the distant rumble of an engine announced the arrival of an official vehicle. A moss-green pickup truck with government plates rolled up the dirt road leading to Abe's cabin, kicking up clouds of dust that sparkled in the autumn sunlight. Dr. Marlene Hargrove stepped out wearing the crisp uniform of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, her expression professional but not unkind as she surveyed the rustic property. "Mr. Whitaker," she called, consulting a clipboard filled with official forms and legal documents. "I'm Dr. Hargrove from the Wildlife Management Division. I understand you've been caring for two wild animals without the proper permits." Abe emerged from his workshop where he had been repairing a broken fence post, wiping his hands on an old rag and nodding respectfully to his unexpected visitor. Behind him, Luna and Rusty appeared in the cabin doorway, their presence alert but not alarmed by the arrival of a stranger. "That's correct, Dr. Hargrove," Abe replied calmly, gesturing toward his unusual companions. "Found them during the spring flood. Both of them half-dead and completely orphaned. Didn't seem right to let them die while I waited for the proper paperwork." Dr. Hargrove consulted her clipboard again, her expression revealing the conflict between her personal sympathies and her professional obligations. "I understand your intentions were humanitarian, Mr. Whitaker, but state regulations require that rescued wildlife be turned over to certified rehabilitation facilities for proper care and eventual release back into their natural habitat. These animals need to learn wild behaviors that will ensure their survival when they're returned to nature." She spent the next several minutes reciting the relevant statutes and explaining the legal framework that governed wildlife rehabilitation, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. Abe listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, to show he understood the regulations she was obligated to enforce. When she finished her official recitation, Abe simply smiled and extended his hand toward the surrounding property. "Would you mind taking a walk with me? Dr. Hargrove, I'd like to show you something before we discuss what happens next." What Dr. Hargrove witnessed over the next hour challenged every assumption she had formed about wildlife rehabilitation during her 15-year career in natural resource management. She watched Rusty select a perfectly straight stick from a pile of kindling and carry it directly to Abe's feet, then settle contentedly beside Luna without any apparent training or coercion. She observed Luna respond to subtle hand signals from Abe while maintaining her wild dignity and independence. Most importantly, she witnessed the profound emotional connection between all three beings, human and animal alike. "How long have they been displaying this level of social integration?" Dr. Hargrove asked, making notes on her clipboard while watching Luna groom Rusty's ears with obvious affection. "Since about the second week," Abe replied, scratching Luna behind her black-tipped ears. "They seemed to understand that survival meant cooperation. Never had to teach them that they figured it out on their own." Despite her growing doubts about the necessity of separation, Dr. Hargrove felt obligated to follow established protocol. The regulations were clear, and her supervisors expected compliance, regardless of individual circumstances or emotional considerations. "I'm afraid I need to order a standard wild readiness assessment," she announced reluctantly. "This involves separating the animals for 24 hours to test their ability to function independently. It's required before any decision can be made about their future placement." The results of this experiment shook Dr. Hargrove's professional confidence to its very foundation. Within hours of separation, both Luna and Rusty exhibited signs of severe psychological distress that went far beyond normal adjustment difficulties. They refused all food and water, paced frantically in their temporary enclosures, and vocalized constantly in what could only be described as calls of anguish. Luna pressed her head into a corner of her cage and remained motionless for hours, while Rusty repeatedly threw himself against the barriers, separating him from his adopted sister. Their distress was so evident and so extreme that Dr. Hargrove found herself questioning not only the wisdom of the separation test, but the entire philosophical framework that governed her profession. When she attempted to reintroduce them after 18 hours, 6 hours ahead of schedule, their reunion was so emotionally intense that she found herself wiping tears from her eyes as she watched them frantically groom each other and vocalize their relief. The professional distance she had maintained throughout her career began to crumble as she realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in wildlife behavioral science. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, watching Luna curl protectively around Rusty while he purred loudly enough to be heard from across the room. "I've never seen anything like this level of interspecies bonding." Comprehensive medical examinations revealed the final piece of information that would change everything. Luna's inner ear had sustained significant damage during her traumatic rescue from the flood, leaving her with impaired spatial orientation that would prove fatal in the wild. Her ability to navigate complex terrain, judge distance accurately, and hunt successfully was permanently compromised, giving her less than a 20% chance of survival if released into her natural habitat. "The damage is extensive," Dr. Hargrove explained to Abe as they reviewed the veterinary reports together. "In the wild, this kind of impairment would be a death sentence. She would be unable to hunt effectively, vulnerable to predators, and likely to become disoriented in unfamiliar territory." For the first time in her career, Dr. Hargrove found herself faced with a situation that existed completely outside the boundaries of standard wildlife management protocols. The emotional bond between Luna and Rusty was not simply touching it, was essential to their psychological and physical well-being. Separating them would constitute a form of cruelty that violated the very principles her profession was designed to protect. After several sleepless nights reviewing case law, consulting with colleagues across the country, and wrestling with the implications of her decision, Dr. Hargrove made an unprecedented choice that would require her to risk her professional reputation for the sake of 2 orphaned animals and the man who had saved them. She filed an emergency report with her supervisors, recommending an experimental classification that would allow Luna and Rusty to remain in Abe's care indefinitely. The document she submitted was titled Exceptional Attachment Provision, Cross-Species Rehabilitation Case, and it proposed officially designating Abe's property as a semi-private wildlife sanctuary, with him serving as the permanent caretaker for both animals. The recommendation cited Luna's medical condition, the demonstrated psychological interdependence between the animals, Abe's proven competence in providing appropriate care, and the unique opportunity to study long-term interspecies relationships in a controlled environment. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece that combined scientific justification with humanitarian concerns in a way that made rejection politically difficult for her supervisors. The approval process took several months of review, during which time Dr. Hargrove made regular visits to monitor the situation and document the ongoing development of the unusual interspecies family. Each visit provided additional evidence that Luna and Rusty were thriving in ways that would have been impossible in any conventional rehabilitation facility. Her official reports detailed their continued emotional and physical development, their increasing integration with Abe's daily routines, and the remarkable ways they had adapted to domestic life while retaining their wild dignity. The documentation she compiled became a case study that would eventually influence wildlife management policies across multiple states. By the following spring, Dr. Hargrove's visits had evolved from official inspections to friendly social calls that all 3 residents of the cabin eagerly anticipated. She began arriving without her uniform and clipboard, instead bringing homemade apple pie and herbal tea to share during long conversations about wildlife behavior, conservation ethics, and the mysterious bonds that can form between different species. During one particularly memorable visit, she found herself sitting on Abe's front porch while Luna calmly licked her hand and Rusty rubbed his head against her shoulder with obvious affection. These wild creatures, who should have maintained their natural wariness of strangers, had somehow learned to distinguish between threat and friendship with remarkable accuracy. Dr. Hargrove said, watching Luna's ice-blue eyes track a hawk circling overhead. I've spent my entire career trying to maintain the boundaries between wild and domestic, between animal and human, but watching the three of you together has made me question whether those boundaries are as important as I thought. Sometimes love finds a way to build bridges across impossible distances. Abe replied, his weathered hand stroking Rusty's rust-colored fur. I learned that from my wife, and these two have reminded me of it every day since the transformation in Dr. Hargrove's professional perspective was profound and lasting. She began advocating for more flexible approaches to wildlife rehabilitation within her department, arguing that individual circumstances sometimes required creative solutions that transcended traditional protocols. Her superiors, initially skeptical of her recommendations, found themselves increasingly convinced as they reviewed her detailed documentation of Luna and Rusty's unprecedented development. To commemorate their official status as permanent residents of Abe's sanctuary, Dr. Hargrove arranged for a professional videographer to document their story for the agency's archives. The resulting film showed Abe sitting in his favorite rocking chair beside the fireplace, speaking in the same gentle tones he had once used to comfort grieving parishioners. People often ask me if it's possible to love an animal the same way you love a human being, he said, his weathered hands stroking Luna's thick fur, while Rusty dozed contentedly at his feet. I can't answer that question with any scientific certainty, but I can tell you about Luna and Rusty and let you draw your own conclusions about the nature of love and family. The video, which was shared within wildlife management circles across the country, sparked discussions about the rigid boundaries that often separate professional wildlife care from emotional connection. Dr. Hargrove received dozens of inquiries from other wildlife professionals who had encountered similar situations but lacked the courage or authority to pursue unconventional solutions. As autumn returned to the Colorado mountains, with its spectacular display of changing leaves, Abe's small cabin had become something far more significant than a simple wilderness dwelling. It was a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where love had transcended species barriers and created something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the mountains in pristine snow that transformed the landscape into a crystalline wonderland. Inside the warm cabin, life followed rhythms that had become as natural and comforting as breathing. Abe would spend his mornings reading beside the fire while Luna positioned herself to maintain visual contact, and Rusty explored every corner of their shared domain with endless curiosity and energy. Evenings were reserved for what Abe privately called family time, though he would have felt foolish saying such words aloud to another human. As the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks and darkness settled over the forest like a comfortable blanket, all three would gather in the living room for the quiet rituals that marked the end of each day. Luna would claim her favorite spot on the hearthrug, where the stones retained warmth from the day's fire. Rusty would curl up in his preferred corner of the old leather chair that had belonged to Sarah, and Abe would settle into his rocking chair with whatever book had captured his interest, though more often than not he found himself simply watching his unusual companions and marveling at the turns his life had taken. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, and snow piled high against the windows like nature's own insulation, something magical would occur. Without any apparent signal or discussion, all three would migrate to positions around Abe's rocking chair. Luna at his feet, Rusty draped across his lap, and the old pastor's hands resting gently on both warm bodies as he read aloud from books of poetry or philosophy. Dr. Hargrove, during her final official visit before the winter roads became impassable, observed one of these quiet evenings, and later wrote in her report that she had witnessed the most perfect expression of interspecies harmony in my professional experience. The shadow cast by the three figures on the cabin wall she noted, seemed to merge into a single silhouette. A living representation of how love can create family bonds that transcend the boundaries of biology and expectation. On Christmas Eve, as snow continued to fall outside in thick, silent curtains, and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Abe found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them all together. 3 years had passed since that terrible night, when the swollen creek had carried away so much, yet somehow delivered the most precious gifts he had ever received. Luna, now fully grown into a magnificent lynx, with a coat like spun moonlight, and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ancient forests, slept peacefully with her head resting on his foot. Rusty, lean and strong and beautifully marked, with nature's own artistry, dozed in his lap with the absolute trust of a creature who had never known anything but love and security in this place. The old pastor had learned many lessons during his decades of ministering to others and his years of solitude in these mountains, but none had been more profound than what these two orphaned animals had taught him about the true nature of family. Blood relationships, he had come to understand, were just one way that souls could find each other in this vast and often lonely world. Sometimes the most profound connections were forged, not through shared genetics, but through shared survival, mutual respect, and the simple decision to love without reservation or expectation. Sometimes family was not something you were born into, but something you chose to create through daily acts of kindness, patience, and devotion. As the wind continued to sing through the mountain pines and the snow deepened around their warm sanctuary, Abe closed his eyes and listened to the gentle breathing of his unusual family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adventures, but tonight there was only peace, contentment, and the certain knowledge that love in all its mysterious and wonderful forms was the greatest miracle any of them would ever witness. In the dancing shadows cast by the firelight, three separate beings had become something greater than the sum of their individual parts. They were living proof that families are not always born. Sometimes they are rescued, nurtured, and chosen with deliberate acts of courage and compassion. And in a small cabin tucked away in the Colorado mountains, that truth glowed as warmly as the embers in the hearth, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt lost, alone, or abandoned by the world.